over here. So the very inner part, again, is really getting into the mouth, different parts of some saliva, those salivary glands, again, things we looked at in lab, where we're kind of moving our way down the digestive tract from the oral cavity, the mouth, getting into the pharynx. Now, the pharynx passes from the mouth into the oropharynx region and then into the laryngopharynx region. And which pharynx is missing? Nasal, because again, we don't want food going up in there. But oropharynx, laryngopharynx, two regions that are shared between respiratory system and digestive system. Now, the pharynx region, oro or laryngo, allows passage of food, fluids, and air. Hence, they share both systems. Now, what lines the pharynx is stratified squamous epithelium. Now, where else in our body do we find stratified squamous epithelium? You can point to it. Has lots of layers. That's the stratified part. Your skin is stratified squamous epithelium. Now, any place we find stratified squamous epithelium in the body, it's usually found where you're going to have lots of abrasion, where you can lose a few cell layers, and that's okay. Now, little modification, the stratified squamous epithelium there also has some mucus-producing glands as well. At some point, you have all eaten something or drank something too hot, or, you chewed a Dorito and you didn't chew it long enough, and then you swallowed it and you all felt it scrape going down. Or you drank something that was burning hot and you could feel it burn going down. That's okay. You can lose a few cell layers with that stratified squamous. It's okay. Luckily, if you didn't chew something long enough and you feel it in your pharynx, you're like, oh my God, I totally should have chewed that longer. It just isn't going down very well. Luckily, it eventually does. We do have mucus-producing glands there as well. They kind of try to help aid the passage of that not chewed very well food and try to help it kind of slide down that pharynx region. Now, we also find skeletal muscle layers in there as well. Again, the same layers. We've got a muscular layer that helps squeeze things. But we also, other than just have regular muscle layers going down, we also have pharyngeal constrictors. Now, any guess what they do? Other than squeeze? That's what constrict means. No one wants to talk. You guys are all just fried. Lab exam and lecture exam. A pharyngeal constrictor is a constrictor, yes, found in the pharynx. I'm like, it helps squeeze the food through, and yes, it also prevents food from going backwards. So it tries to squeeze the food through, going from the pharynx into the next region, which is the esophagus. And so once it goes through those pharyngeal constrictors, it squeezed it through, we end up in the esophagus, which is a flat muscular tube. It's flat when it's empty. When you eat or drink something, it will expand back up. Otherwise, it's just flattened. There's really not a lot of muscle tone that's, needed to keep it open. It goes all the way from the laryngopharynx until it eventually enters into the stomach region. So you can see the very bottom part of the esophagus. Now, the diaphragm goes right across to all of this. And so that esophagus actually goes right through the diaphragm. There's a hole in the diaphragm called the esophageal hiatus. A hiatus means like an opening. And so the esophagus can go right through that opening in the diaphragm. So we can go from the top part of our thoracic cavity down into our abdominal cavity. It meets up with the stomach at what's called the cardial orifice. An orifice is an opening. There's just an opening in the stomach. And we already looked in lab. The top part of the stomach is the cardiac region. So there's just a hole in the cardiac region, cardial orifice. Now, at the top here, also lab, there's a cardiac sphincter. You can also call it the gastroesophageal. Cardiac's easier. The cardiac sphincter surrounds that cardial orifice or the opening right there. What's it do? Do what? Prevents backflow, so we don't have acid going up into the esophagus. Because if it does, it leads to heartburn. If acid starts going into the esophagus, the stomach is built to be able to withstand the acid. It's got a whole bunch of different things in place to withstand the acid. The esophagus is not meant to withstand that strong acid. Now, things that can increase your chance of having heartburn, excessive food or drinking, and I'm like, which means your stomach is just really full and it just wants to go backwards. Extreme obesity, pregnancy, and running can eventually make some of that, the acid juices in the food try to go upward. It can also happen on rarer occasions. You can have what's known as a hiatal hernia. When the top part of your stomach, instead of being below the diaphragm, part of the top part of the stomach is now above the diaphragm. Again, the esophagus should go through the diaphragm and the stomach sits underneath. On rare occasions, it happens that the stomach tries to go through that, the little opening there, the hiatus, and now you have part of your stomach, which means every time the diaphragm contracts, it's putting pressure on that stomach and it's squirting some of that stomach acid up into the esophagus. This is usually, and I'm like, well, it can be surgically fixed. Occasionally it goes away on its own. Kind of depends what caused it. But if left untreated, if heartburn is left untreated, it can cause esophagitis, inflammation of the esophagus, because you're wearing away at the esophagus lining. Esophageal ulcers, again, it completely wears away at it. Now you have these big open sores inside your esophagus. And anytime you damage any type of tissue, it increases your chance of cancer. Yes? Oh, I don't know. I haven't heard that. It might be a wives' tale. I had lots of heartburn and my kids are bald, or were bald till like they were 3. I don't know. I haven't heard that. It shouldn't have anything to do with it whatsoever. I was like, normally it's just pregnancy. You've got this big, massive thing pushing on the stomach all the time. Now, the esophagus, looking at the layers. And again, it's got 4 basic layers. Like you still have the lumen. You've got the mucosa, submucosa, the muscularis, and the adventitia. Now, the esophageal mucosa, yes, you have stratified squamous epithelium. And so instead of, and I'm like, I changed it, I'm like, instead of, and I'm like, because again, these 4 basic layers we went over in lab, there's modifications and changes as we go through different parts of the digestive system. In your esophagus, instead of having simple columnar, you have stratified squamous. And I'm like, so that's one difference. Like, these are your 4 basics, but we've got changes as we go throughout. As soon as you hit the stomach, you see an abrupt change from stratified squamous to simple columnar. Like there's an immediate stratified squamous, simple columnar going from esophagus into stomach. The esophageal glands in the submucosa, again, we're making lots of mucus. That's going to help move that food through the esophagus, especially if it didn't chew well and drink well enough. You still have the 2 layers of the muscle here, and I'm like, you have a skeletal on the top and a smooth on the inside. Just because, I was going to say, the skeletal like on top of the esophagus versus smooth on the bottom. Even though it's skeletal muscle at the top of the esophagus, that still doesn't mean you have a lot of control over it. Generally, once you swallow and it gets into your oral pharynx, you really have no control over that food anymore. But there is still some skeletal muscle as it's transitioning into smooth muscle. And then on the outside of the esophagus, we call it a fibrous adventitia. And I'm like, it just means that very, very outer layer is just a little extra fibrous. And I'm like, it's a little extra protection of where it's sitting. It helps anchor it in place so it doesn't move around. Now, some processes. There's lots of digestive processes that happen. Starting at the top, some digestive processes. One is ingestion. Ingestion is just bringing food into the mouth. It's a process. You have to put it in. Then we have mechanical digestion. This is the physical act of breaking the food up from big pieces to small pieces. Your teeth help with that. Your tongue helps smush things apart. That's mechanical digestion. It's just the physical act of breaking things apart. Propulsion is moving food forward. We're moving it not from just the mouth, but we eventually want to get it into the pharynx and then down into the stomach. The actual act of swallowing is called deglutition. I think it's my next slide. Other than mechanical digestion happening in the mouth, there is some chemical digestion happening as well. which means now we're using chemicals, enzymes, to break the food down. So it's not just teeth and tongue, breaking that food down into smaller pieces. Now we have enzymes that are chemically breaking down. Now, lingual lipase, based on its name, lip, any guess what it breaks down? It breaks down fats. And so in our saliva, we have lingual lipases that are just starting to break down fats. It's not the main place where fats get broken down. Also in our saliva, we have salivary amylase. Yes, it's an enzyme that ends in ase. This starts helping break down carbohydrates in our mouth. Again, that's not the big place where you've got chemical digestion taking place. No absorption takes place inside the mouth. There are a few drugs that you can put them on your tongue and you can absorb them into your system. However, food-wise, we are not absorbing any of our food into our body and our mouth. That all happens later. Mastication is the official act for chewing. If you're masticating, you are chewing. Now, when you are chewing, your cheeks and your closed lips hold all the food in between your teeth. We want that in between our teeth. The tongue mixes that food around with all the saliva that's in there, and it will compact the food into what we call a food bolus. Think a bolus is a ball, a little food ball. Our teeth help cut and grind. Some of our chewing is voluntary, some of it is reflexive. You've probably all at some point, you just put food in, you don't even realize you're chewing it. You're not even thinking, it's reflexive. However, it can be voluntary. You can be like, I'm going to do 15 chews before I swallow. You can, think about it if you want to and change your chewing. Otherwise, for most people, we don't even think about it. We just put food in and we chew and we swallow and it never crosses our mind. So part voluntary, part reflexive. Now, the deglutition, which is the actual swallowing. So when I'm talking deglutition, I'm talking swallowing. We need to get food from the mouth eventually into our esophagus. So things that are involved in swallowing: the tongue, the soft palate, the pharynx, and the esophagus, because it eventually has to get there. Now, two phases: the buccal phase, this is the mouth, and then the pharyngeal esophageal phase, the buccal phase, which is happening in the mouth. This is voluntary. Again, you can have control over it if you would like to. The pharyngeal esophageal phase, involuntary. By the time the food gets into the pharynx, you don't have any control over it anymore. Anything else that controls it, that's all nervous system, medulla, and part of your pons starts to move that food through. Now, I think I broke it down. I was going to say, here's all the steps. Here's zoomed in and big. So here's my food. Do I have a first? Nope. There we go. There's my food bolus, ball of food. Now, during the buccal phase, yes, you are mixing it up with saliva, and I'm like your teeth, your tongue, mixing it all around. At some point, you're going to take your tongue and you're going to smush it up to the roof of the mouth against that soft palate. So I'm like kind of near the back of the oral cavity. Now, and I'm like, it will eventually, I'm like, once we get it, I'm like, I don't really love my transition between 1 and 2. And I'm like, we get it back to the soft palate. The tongue will help move it into the oropharynx region. But once it moves into the oropharynx region, that's when you get into the pharyngeal, the pharynx, esophageal phase. Now we don't have control over it. We went from in the mouth into the oral pharynx, a little bit into the laryngeal pharynx. However, the uvula moved. Why? We don't want food to go down into the respiratory tract. We don't want food in our drinks and our lungs. It's really bad. And I'm like, so the uvula will go down. It will try to block any of that food and or liquids from going out into the respiratory tract. The mouth will also go up to the top and try to block food from going back in. Kind of like once it goes in the pharynx, we don't want it to come back. That upper esophageal sphincter, and I'm like, will contract to hopefully we don't have food again going backwards. And I'm like, and your esophagus, and I'm like, will start to squeeze that food all the way through till eventually, I was going to say squeezing, until eventually it starts to go into the stomach. Now, again, there's another sphincter there, so once it goes through, it can't go backwards. I'm like, where I won't go into stomach. I'm like, but buccal phase, get it to the top back of the mouth, then eventually goes into the oropharynx as part of the pharyngeal. We're squeezing it through until it's eventually in the stomach. Now, we'll talk more next time on Thursday about the process of how it squeezes it all the way through. And then we'll look a little bit more at the stomach. But we'll just end right there. Short little bit.